Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. We're going to be making a speed run through all the key business news stories you need to know about from across the African continent in the next half hour. The theme for today, broadly speaking, is trade. Here's what's coming up. South Africa escalates its dispute to the EU over citrus import bans to the WTO. Speaking of the EU, it's pledged to provide more funds and investments in Egypt. And we'll be looking at the story of how a young South African sowed his way to fame and fortune. Welcome to the program. Let's start in East Africa, Tanzania to be specific. It has endorsed a regional deal with the European Union, clearing the way in effect for Kenyan products to regain duty-free export access to European markets. Now that of course was extremely vital to completing an economic partnership agreement between the East African Community on one hand and the EU on the other after nearly a decade of talks. All members of the East African Community needed to sign the deal for it to be valid. Putting it into effect, however, could take up to half a year. Now, beyond the elimination of customs duties, the agreement also does cover issues like the free movement of goods, cooperation and customs and taxation, and trade defense instruments as well. Tanzanian delegates had requested for more time for consultation when Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda and Burundi signed the pact earlier this week on Tuesday. Now, with the EPAs between the European Union and the East African Community now signed, done and dusted, both sides are describing the event as a success. But is this deal a fair one? Our correspondent in Brussels, Sandra Gathman, has been speaking to experts who say the EU may try to continue negotiating for preferential access to African markets.
Brussels is celebrating the completion of a free trade partnership with East African countries, which entered negotiations back in 2007. EU officials are describing it as a win-win deal
for African countries because they gain or regained the duty-free, quota-free access to the European market, so they can export whatever they want and as much as they want. And it's also a good opportunity for Europe because our trade partners are our political partners and our friends. And I think with trade there will be more prosperity as well, both in Africa and in the European Union.
But some trade experts warn there's nothing new in the EPA deals and that European companies stand to benefit more in the long term.
That they have secured the market access that they have now and which they had for 40 years. So there's nothing new in it for them. And what will happen in the future, which is about 5 years, what will happen is that then Kenya and the other countries will have to eliminate their import taxes, which means that it will have less government revenue from that, and European products are starting to come into the region. So they have secured their present market access, but they haven't secured their future.
Kenya has stood in particular danger of facing import duties when its current EU tax deal expired this month. Kenya had a particular incentive to race through this free trade deal, with a looming deadline of the 1st of October threatening 22% of its exports which go to the EU, of which 9% are fresh flowers. Pressure from Kenya's horticulture industry led to a rapid signing of the deal this week, but experts warn East Africa is not taking a long-term view about Europe's future interests in the region.
An important point from the European Commission or from the European institution is actually have a wider access to African markets. Of course, there is an asymmetry that is included in those agreements. That means that first, African will have preferences, and then step by step European private sector will have preferences on African market.
Experts claim the EU will continue to press for those terms.
The initial idea of the European Union with regard to the EPAs was to have very broad comprehensive agreements that would not only deal with the trade in goods, but would also introduce liberalization of the trade in services, investments, government procurement. They would also add disciplines on intellectual property rights, on data collection and so forth. So that was a very comprehensive agenda. That didn't fly. The ACP countries didn't go for that. But there is a rendezvous clause in the agreement that says that after the agreement has come into force, some months after that, the parties will come back together again to see what kind of roadmap they would draw up to negotiate also these issues. And these issues are the main offensive issues of the European Union in these negotiations.
With parliamentary ratification still needed on both sides, it may be years before the final terms are mutually agreed. Sandra Gatman, CCTV, Brussels.
Now, South Africa has escalated a dispute with the European Union over phytosanitary standards for its citrus exports to the World Trade Organization. In a statement, South Africa's Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davies described the EU's threat to ban fruit exports altogether due to the citrus black spot disease as protectionist. He said there is absolutely no scientific consensus, much less evidence, to support the EU's claim that fruit from South Africa with the fungal disease could infect European orchards. South Africa is the main source of oranges used to produce the juice consumed in the UK, Germany and France, especially in the summer. Southern European growers fear the fungus, however, could take hold in their citrus groves. It should be important to point out at this point, however, that CBS, while unsightly, is harmless to humans. Davies said the ban on South Africa's citrus exports was, quote, aimed at restricting highly competitive citrus imports to the benefit of citrus producers in the European Union. Let's expand this conversation now and reel in Jack Parrock is in Brussels. Sumitra Naidu has been keeping tabs on this story for us from Johannesburg. They're both live right now. Jack, let's start with you. Has there been any formal response from the EU to South Africa's move to escalate this dispute to the WTO?
As yet, we haven't heard anything from the European Commission. I've been ringing them to see what's going on. But at the moment, what we've seen happen is that this dispute, up until this point, has always been done in the health department of the European Commission. It was a dispute between the two sides, with the farmers saying that the European farmers saying that this citrus black spot disease might affect their yields, and therefore it was considered a health issue. But now, with this referral up to the World Trade Organization, it's now moved into the Department of Trade, and it will become a trade dispute between the two sides, more specifically to how it has been in the past. So we've seen over the last 10 years, however, originally it was you needed 175 cases needed to be obstructed on their way into the European Union, and that number's now decreased to 5, which is why the South Africans are saying this is a protectionist issue, and why farmers from southern European nations are being accused of this protectionist attitude.
Indeed, Sumitra, South Africa tried to resolve this problem through the International Plant Protection Convention based in Rome. What results, if any, did that process bring about?
Well, Rama, the International Plant Protection Convention is a neutral forum for dispute resolution, and it does not have legally binding powers, but its recommendations do hold weight, especially at the World Trade Organization. But this process takes a bit of time. Now, the convention is now in the process of putting together an expert panel to look into the dispute between South Africa and the EU. It's called for the nomination of experts to be part of this panel. These individuals will need to have a scientific background in the citrus black spot and should be independent of this dispute. All submissions need to be in by the 31st of October. Now, once that panel is in place, it may take a few weeks before any findings are made available.
Indeed, Jack. As you mentioned earlier, the EU Commission not particularly responding, but in the past, how has it responded to arguments from South Africa that this is purely protectionist trade policy, trying to shield Southern European farmers and not anything really to do with phytosanitary standards?
Now, interestingly, the European Commission's own studies into this say that citrus black spot can only be transmitted and kind of brought in by the plants and not by the fruit itself, so that the plant that the fruit grows on. So they've had difficulty trying to prove their reasons for this, but they say that the pressure that they receive from the farmers, who are the European farmers, who are concerned about their yields, means that they have to impose these the ban has been on and off over the last few years, but that's the reason they've had to do it. Interestingly, normally when the ban comes in, it's on the off season when South Africa wouldn't be exporting into the European Union, and then when the seasons change, when the European farmers wouldn't be able to produce the needs, that's when they lift the ban, and that's where South Africa gets angry about it. But at the moment also we're looking into the Russian situation currently with the sanctions against Russia, and Russia having banned imports into the Russian Federation of European foods. There's some idea that this might be a way for the Europeans to fulfill their own production needs, but obviously, as I said, with the seasons coming back and forth, that might not be possible. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how the EU goes about this when it gets to the World Trade Organization dispute level.
Indeed. Final question to you, Sumitra. The WTO process will take anywhere between 12 to 18 months to actually come to a conclusion. Do citrus farmers in South Africa still expect to have access, as fragile as relations are, to the EU as this dispute gets sorted out of the WTO?
Well, I put that question to the Department of Trade and Industry this afternoon, and the response was that everything will continue as per normal. But if you set aside government's response here and look at farmers, they're very worried. This battle over the black spot disease has been going on for almost 4 years now. The European Commission's Food and Safety Authority slapped a temporary ban on citrus fruit from South Africa last year. The ban was lifted in May this year, but then South Africa was placed on extra safety measures, which means that if there is any fruit found with the black spot disease, the entire consignment of fruit would be impounded. In September this year, the Citrus Growers Association of South Africa on its own decided to suspend citrus exports to the EU for fear of attracting a permanent ban. Now, if a ban is put in place, between 60 and 80,000 jobs would be at stake. The economy could lose up to 26 billion rand. And South Africa is remaining, adamant on this issue that there is no scientific consensus to support the EU's claim that CBS could infect European orchards. However, if the WTO rules in favor of South Africa, the EU could decide to ignore the ruling or appeal. And it does remain very risky at this stage, but it seems that South Africa is standing its ground on this one.
Indeed, we certainly live in interesting times. We'll have to leave it there. Jack Parakov in Brussels in Belgium. He'll keep tabs on the story from the EU's perspective, and Sumitra Naidu, of course, will be chasing it down from the South African one. Now, we're still on the EU. The body has pledged more funds and investments to Egypt for 2015. In a conference held in Cairo, Egypt's Prime Minister and members of the government met EU officials and economic experts to review the performance of the economy and projects which both sides are undertaking. CCTV's Yasser Kim has more.
The EU has just announced a €3.5 billion deal to finance and implement developmental and social projects in Egypt over 2 years. This is more than double the last batch in 2011. Egypt's Prime Minister Ibrahim Mehleb stressed that the EU deal is a sign of confidence in the performance of the government and latest reforms.
Financial institutions we met say they are very impressed with our achievement. In only 6 months, we have improved our security situation and adopted major austerity measures. The last quarter has seen a 3.7% growth, up from 2.2%. International experts were amazed by our fast pace, but we target even more growth now.
Egypt's trade with EU accounts to 32% of Egypt's total trade with the world. It has risen by 5% in 2014 to reach $33 billion. Investments, however, have dropped significantly in the last 3 years because of security concerns. Total foreign investments are at a low $2.8 billion from an average $8 billion per year before 2011. Officials hope they can turn it around.
We have a huge market in telecommunication, and our infrastructure and base is developed with potential for growth. We prepared feasibility studies to attract more investors to add to our portfolio of multinational giants working in this industry here for years.
Tourism, the main source of hard currency for Egypt, has always depended on European tourists. It is trying to recover from a downturn since 2011.
75% of our tourists are European. It's a market we cannot ignore and are working hard to bring in more. Italians are very interested to invest in our new destinations. Italian and British tourists were the ones who literally placed Sharm el-Sheikh and Hurghada on the world tourism map. We plan the same with our new destinations.
But one major attraction to the European investors is the new Suez Canal project. The project's first phase began last August.
There are so many of them. We've heard about the Suez Canal and the development of that very important project. This will take a lot of private investment, including from Europe. The investment conference in February will be extremely important, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of European interest in that, both from the banks and from our companies and from the European Union institutions themselves. So we're looking forward to that.
A main setback, however, is the extremely complicated bureaucratic system and business regulations, considered non-friendly for any investments. The Egyptian Prime Minister said that a new set of investment laws will be announced in the next 2 months to improve the business environment. He targets 2015 to be the year where the Egyptian economy would take off after 4 years of decline. Yasser Hakim for CCTV, Cairo.
Kenya is positioning itself to become a more attractive investment destination, and it's doing that by increasing its power generation capacity and hopefully lowering the cost of electricity in the long run as well. The Kenyan President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta launched a new geothermal power plant on Friday that's adding over 140 megawatts of generation capacity to the grid. By the end of this year, the state-controlled Kenya Electricity Generating Company, better known by the more snappy KenGen, will have added over 300 megawatts of geothermal generation capacity. And that should help cut power bills by at least 30% by government estimates. Businesses say the high cost of electricity in Kenya makes the country uncompetitive. Olkaria is the biggest geothermal power plant of its kind on the continent, and it places Kenya at the forefront of green power.
The cost of power is critical, is essential, as an essential cog to every part of our society, from industry to homes, unless first we are able to increase the available quantity of power, and two, to make that power affordable so as to be able to become an attractive investment destination for industry, which then will enable us to create the kind of jobs and the number of jobs that we have promised Kenyans.
The contract was signed in April 2012 and the project started in August of the same year. Now, after 2 years, the project is largely completed and able to generate electricity.
Quick run through the markets for you. The only recovery we're seeing across the board today is in South Africa. The main indices up by over 200 basis points across the board. Broadly, a bit of a recovery, if you will. Market makers are buying back into the market, especially given the sentiments that maybe the sell-off from global markets have been a bit overdone. Whether or not this gains can be sustained moving into next week, however, we'll have to wait and see.
We do know that the strike isn't anywhere near close to coming to an end either. That means that those workers are going to sink even further into poverty.
Now then, let's look at the question of Ebola. It's been a key problem and a fairly big story for us across the board. Over 4,400 people dead so far. Now, it's not only damaged the health of affected nations, but it's also inflicting revenue losses for businesses and various government sectors. Zimbabwe's tourism industry, even though the country has absolutely no Ebola cases, is the latest victim.
Zimbabwe's tourism sector is reported to have lost about $6 million in potential revenue, blamed on alleged misleading media reports that the country was not taking the Ebola scare seriously. Some countries are reported to have pulled out of this month's Zimbabwe Tourism Expo, while potential visitors are cancelling or postponing visits to the country.
We have had cancellations, booked cancellations, confirmed cancellations, and in some cases paid cancellations. People will pay for their holidays in Zimbabwe. They are demanding their money back because they've cancelled because of Ebola. And when I did my last calculation by the beginning of this month, we found out that close to $6 million US have been lost in cancellations due to Ebola.
Although the major outcry in Zimbabwe has been whether the country is equipped to prevent the disease from breaching its borders, the health ministry continues to argue that there is no Ebola in Zimbabwe. Officials in the ministry say they are ready to deal with Ebola, adding that the government has put in place strict measures to screen and monitor people coming from Ebola-affected countries.
UN recently, when this question was put to them about readiness of Zimbabwe and so on, one of the comments was that Zimbabwe is a well-prepared country in the sense that they've got the basic infrastructure. Hospitals are there, clinics are there, and so on. So we are more or less better off than our sister nations out in the West Africa.
Outbreak control requires a coordinated series of medical services, along with corporate involvement and a certain level of community engagement. International carriers have suspended flights to affected countries to minimize the spread, leading to a slowdown in business activity for most countries across the globe, especially in Africa. Valdi Karlse, CCTV.
That recovery in global commodities is pretty much the same story we're looking at with respect to commodity prices. Oil, of course, was at about 4.5-4-year lows, depending on which one you're looking at. 86.22 is a relevant number here. We're still chasing the bottom here, unfortunately. Technically, yes, we are oversold, but until supply corrects to reflect demand moving forward, the odds are that we're still going to see a lot more red ink on our prices moving forward. Coming up next, we'll hear from a young South African whose designs are all the rage in London. All that and more is coming up. Welcome back. Now, despite the hype around it, the fashion industry is not an easy one to break into. South African-born Lesego Malatsi was an unemployed fashion graduate. In order to earn a living, he ended up going to a local sewing project and began to use the equipment to create his work. On Grassroots Tonight, he talks about his Afrocentric creations, which today are being sold in London.
My name is Lesego Malatsi and I'm a designer and the MD of Mzansi Designers Emporium. I studied at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, and when I came back to Johannesburg, I had hoped to find a job, but unfortunately I couldn't find any. I didn't have money, I didn't have the resources to start a business, and I bumped into a lady who was part of a sewing group. We had a trade exchange. I developed patterns for them and they allowed me to use their sewing machines. And then later I joined with other designers to establish what we now call Mzansi Designers. Our design concept, it's based on his and hers, the look. I needed to come up with designs that were distinctive and that would have represented me and perhaps South Africa. And I developed the Afrocentric look. This is your traditional shweshwe fabric on this shirt, and I mixed it with a linen. You know, normally I would have been told that you can't mix the cotton with the linen. It becomes a challenge with the import tariffs and with the export codes that you cannot label it a cotton, you cannot label it a linen, because then it gives a different, it's a different item which is not listed. Coming here in Maponya Mall in Soweto to establish my flagship retail store was not an easy task. I remember I had just completed an order for the city of Johannesburg, and from the profits I managed to build up the store. This dress here, which retails for about $100. This wedding outfit, it's pure Afrocentric in a sense that inspired by the Tswana culture, you know, with beads and the colors that the Tswana people use. My contact in Cambridge actually came and bought a shirt from here. From there, we started, talking, and then I got an invitation to come and showcase at Cambridge, and it helped to start up in Cambridge. It was a case of how do we penetrate, because the people who have the money are pro-Western style of design. My main market has been mostly black, as in the affluent, but at least the perception is changing now, and people feel comfortable to wear Afrocentric clothing to work, and it's slightly becoming that it's acceptable. This is Mzansi Designers Emporium's new premises at number 5 Loveday Street in Johannesburg. This is part of our growth plan to be able to service our new retail store that is coming in Limpopo, and to service our international market. I could write a book.
As far as currencies are concerned, the real story lies with the Nigerian naira. Amid the fall of the oil prices around the world, the naira has taken quite the hits, down about 3 to 4% so far this year. Whether or not that trend continues next week, given the correction we've seen today, we'll have to find out later on Monday. But for now, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. You know the usual drill. Feedback to globalbusinessafrica@cctv.com. Facebook and Twitter are also your ports of call whenever we're off the airwaves. We'll see you on Monday. Thank you for watching. Famida Miller's up next with Matchpoint.